So I call this the hardest working river in the West. The Colorado River really is the hardest working river in the West. The Columbia is obviously very hardworking, many other rivers, but as you'll see, the Colorado, there's a lot more asked of it than it really can do. Oops, I have to figure out how. Okay, first, I want to just mention some kind of important details about this river, because this will come into play as we go along. Let's see, there we go. I see mine. Okay, so this is the 47th longest river in the world. Our Colorado River. This is the picture is the Colorado River up in Rocky Mountain National Park, where it is literally about 8 feet wide, just a little baby river. This river does not rank among the top 142 rivers in the world by discharge. I don't know exactly where it does rank, but it's definitely not in the top 142. And it is the 37th in the United States by discharge. And that's rivers that flow into or through the United States or arise in the United States. So this is a pretty small river when you think about it. You compare to other rivers, and it's not a huge river. Oops, there we go. Some other things that I think are really important to realize are that more than 10% of the people in the United States rely on this river for part or all of their water. That's a huge number. And if you look at Mexico and the United States together, it's more than 40 million people. And this is for a river that doesn't even rank in the top 142 rivers in the world in terms of discharge. So these are just some little factoids that I wanted to, just keep in your head for right now. And something that I also wanted to say is I think they're recording this. If you want any of these slides, because I do have some that have quite a bit of text on them, and the reason for that is because I know they're recording this and you can come back to them, and I thought that text was kind of important, so please let me know. So I'm going to mention what the law of the river is, and this is a specific thing. That's why it's capitalized. The law of the river is a collection of laws, treaties, and compacts that determine how much Colorado River water belongs to each state in the basin and Mexico, and how that water will be managed, stored, and delivered. So this is an actual package of legalese that is allowing us to use the water from the Colorado River. And obviously, there have been modifications over the years, new treaties, things like that. But I will be talking about the law of the river, and I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of what the law of the river is. Okay, now some background before we get to our modern world. So this is the map of our country in the mid-1860s. And you can see that the West does not have a lot of settlement, a lot of development. All of the roads and the cities are really in this eastern half. At this time, our country was an agrarian nation. Yes, we had some cities, but the vast majority of the people in the country were living in an agrarian lifestyle. So this is kind of important to keep in mind. But in the mid-1860s, especially after the Civil War, everybody from over here was looking over here for potential for settlement and moving and making it big, things like that. So in 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, and that gave settlers 160 acres, and that they could improve, meaning they would put a little house on it, they would grow crops. If they didn't improve it, they would lose the land. Well, this worked great if you had access to water. So the Homestead Act worked in a lot of places. It did not work so well in the West. And of the over 500,000 claims that were started between 1862 and 1882, so 20 years, only a little over 190,000 were actually completed. So what happened to the rest of that land? That land was taken over by land speculators. And as you understand, as we go on, you'll understand that this was actually probably part of the plan. So 1869, you guys probably all recognize this guy. This is John Wesley Powell. And he went down the river. He was the first, certainly the first European to explore the river in a controlled fashion. There's always some question about whether or not there was a guy named James White who was on a raft and running away from Indians and floated down the river. But he's the first one to really explore it in an organized fashion. And that trip really gave him, and plus all of his work in the area, exploring the area, really gave him an idea of what the West was like. And he was a man who really understood the quality and the character of the land. A lot of other people did too. He wasn't the only one, but he was kind of one of the more famous ones for us. Now, at the same time, in the mid-1860s, this map came out. It's called a rain chart of the United States. And if you see, again, look at my little hand there, you notice that the eastern half of the country, and then also up here in the Pacific Northwest, is very blue. And then over here in the West, it's very not blue. It's very, very map colored. And if you look at a closer, piece of this, and then the explanation, what these are these lines represent inches of rain. And so you have the darkest blue color is 56 inches and over. The lightest blue color is 20 to 32 inches of rain. So this is a close-up of the area right in New Mexico, Nebraska, Utah, Arizona. And you can see this line right here coming up from Texas and on up to the north. This is the 100th, roughly the 100th longitude line, the 100th meridian. Everything to the west of that, except for the Pacific Northwest, is considered the arid lands. It used to be called the Great American Desert. What I think is fascinating is it says 20 to 32 inches of rain here. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen 20 to 32 inches of rain in our area for quite a long time. So things have changed even from this time. Now, this is one of those long things that you don't have to worry about reading it. You can, or you can listen to me reading it. But this is in the 1870s, and this was the prevailing idea at the time among scientists and land speculators. This is what they put forth. Suppose an army of frontier farmers 50 miles in width from Manitoba to Texas could, acting in concert, turn over the prairie sod, and after deep plowing and receiving the rain and moisture, present a new surface of green growing crops instead of dry, hard-baked earth covered with sparse buffalo grass. No one can question or doubt the inevitable effect of this cooling, condensing surface upon the moisture in the atmosphere as it moves over by the western winds. A reduction of temperature must at once occur, accompanied by the usual phenomena of showers. The chief agency in this transformation is agriculture. God speed the plow by this wonderful provision, which is only man's mastery over nature. The clouds are dispensing copious rains. The plow is the instrument which separates civilization from savagery and converts a desert into a farm or garden. To be more concise, rain follows the plow. So this concept that if you plowed the earth and that freshly turned soil, the moisture from that soil would rise into the air, condense, and cause rain to come down. That was something that was really being pushed to people who wanted to settle in the West. And I don't know if if the speculators really believed this, or if they just knew that wasn't going to happen and they could get people out there and then take their land, who knows. But this was a sort of a pseudoscience idea that was going on at the time. And so in 1878, Powell, he actually published his report on the lands of the arid region. He distributed it to Congress, and he was trying to counteract the hang on, I gotta move my little thing, Charles Dana Wilbur's concept of the rain follows the plow. He recognized what the land was all about, and that if you didn't have access to water, you weren't going to be able to do anything. So his idea was to actually do an irrigation survey to look at the lands of the West, the arid lands of the West, and try and divide them up in a way that made more sense given the inherent sort of challenges of this land. And so this is what he came up with. It's a beautiful map. If you did see my Powell talk at some point, you saw me show this map before. This is a map of what Powell called the watershed commonwealths of the arid lands. And you can see right here the eastern boundary of the arid region here, which is that line where everything got really blue to the right and less blue to the left. And then each one of these colors represents a different watershed. And so Powell's concept was divide the West up by watershed, by commonwealths that are based on the watershed, not by these, just straight lines like we do. And within each watershed, the people would manage their own watershed. Now, he's not the only person to come up with this idea. I mean, he was kind of the first to really do this beautiful map. But then and these little things are parentheses over here. This is just a parenthetical statement. A few years later, there was Orrin Donaldson, who was actually a newspaper publisher, came up with this same idea where he took the whole West and he made the states based on the watersheds. So repartitionment of the arid West by these drainage basins. So a few people had this idea. And here's how Powell had it work. So each watershed would be divided into three divisions, three sections, three regions. So the first is the timbered uplands. So these areas would provide the timber. They would also provide the water. So Powell proposed that you put a lot of small reservoirs in these upland areas, and then that water could be brought downstream to the more lowland areas who needed it. Then the middle elevation, what he called the pasturage lands, these would support low densities of cattle and sheep. He was specific about low densities. He suggested eliminating fences to restore the open range so that overgrazing wouldn't occur. And then these areas would provide the meat and the dairy for the other regions in the watershed. And then the irrigable lowlands. So these are the lowlands that would be the main supplier of all the crops that were needed by all three regions. And I love this picture because it does not look particularly irrigable, but this is the Imperial Valley, now the breadbasket of the United States, in the early 1900s, before it became what it is today. So everything else in these regions, Powell called the wastelands. So I put these pictures in just to show you that we all live in a wasteland. And these are some of the most spectacular landscapes. People come from all over the world, but these were wastelands to Powell because you couldn't use them for any of these important human endeavors. Tourism was not really a thing back in the 1870s. So some important things to keep in mind. Powell wanted some government oversight of these projects, right? But not very much. He did see government oversight. He thought that that was really important, but not so much that the government basically took everything over. He was a massive fan of agricultural development. That was in his time and in his mind, this was the highest use of the land. It was a very Jeffersonian ideal. Powell was not anti-reservoirs or anti-water projects. He wanted them, but on a smaller scale and in the right places. So you put the reservoirs in those timbered uplands, and the water goes within that watershed down to the people who need it. And then Powell believed that really human use of the land was the best use of the land. Anything else, anything that couldn't be used by humans was pointless. So these are all things that in Powell's day and age, this was really common. But this was his perspective on how this landscape should be settled. Well, needless to say, there was way too much money in this landscape for the powers that be, i.e. the railroads, the speculators, and the politicians, who were often the same thing, to go along with Powell's idea of having this watershed commonwealth be the way we settled the West. So they pretty much put the kibosh on this whole thing. and started really pushing people or encouraging people to come out to the West. And they started doing all kinds of these water congresses, and all through the 90s, 1890s, there were these water congresses all over the West where people would get together and figure out what to do with the water in the West. And Powell very famously came to one of these in 1893, and he said, there is not enough water to irrigate all these lands. There is not sufficient water to irrigate all the lands which could be irrigated, and only a small portion can be irrigated. I tell you, gentlemen, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply these lands. So this is a very famous quote where everyone says, oh, yeah, okay, I guess he saw this coming. Well, needless to say, nobody listened to him because, again, there was just too much money and too much power in controlling the water in the West. So this is another one of these where, again, don't worry about reading it too much. Just you can get to it later when it's unrecorded. But in 1894, the Carey Act authorized the donation of up to 1 million acres per state of desert lands to individual states that had public lands. So these had to be settled and irrigated within a number of years, or this would go back to the public domain. So these states were not allowed to sell these lands or lease them or dispose of these lands in any way except to assure their reclamation, their cultivation, and their settlement. Again, human use, right? The states have got to do what's best for the humans with this land, or back to the public domain. Also, right around the same time, this is a really long one, but focus on the bolded stuff. 1902, the Reclamation Act passed, actually the same year that John Wesley Powell died. It's created the Reclamation Service, or now what we know as the Bureau of Reclamation. And this act allowed for water could only be delivered to farms of 160 acres or less, or 320 acres if you were a couple. This was based on Powell's idea. He did not want to see these massive water monopolies, and he suggested these cooperative water districts to try and stave off that. The act further stipulated that anyone who did receive federal water for an area larger than that 160 acres had to sell those extra acres within 10 years at the going price before the land was irrigated. That's important. And that the land could only be sold to people who were willing to live on and work it, as opposed to, say, irrigation companies. So if you read that text, you think, well, that doesn't sound like what the Bureau of Reclamation did at all. You know, the original purpose of the Bureau of Reclamation was to help the family farmer, the small farms, as opposed to these massive irrigation companies. So what happened? Well, that 160 acre limit was not popular with Western senators and Western congressmen, who were also land speculators, water speculators. So they started blocking its implementation, and they wanted to really favor those large corporate agricultural interests over the small family farmer, which kind of sounds familiar. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess, is the motto there. Okay, now this is another one of these text heavy slides, but again, this is important stuff, so I really wanted to point this out. Now, water rights in the East and the West are managed really differently. And this is a generalization because obviously since then there have been some differences, but in general, water rights in the East are what are known as riparian rights. And these water rights establish the right to use water based on the area of land that somebody owns that fronts a water source. So you have to actually have land fronting a water source. And then the water rights are tied to that adjoining land. They can't be separated from it. Water cannot be transferred from a watershed without taking into account the needs of those downstream users. Okay, so it's a little bit more cooperative, but it's also based on having lots more water, which they do in the East. This is actually this is based on English water law. Now in the West, we use largely what's called prior appropriation. And the major tenets of prior appropriation are, okay, you've heard of this probably, first in time, first in right. So the first people to start using the water have the greatest rights to that water, what we call senior water rights. Water rights are separate from the adjoining land, and they can be sold or mortgaged like any other property. This is a big difference between the two. With prior appropriation, what we call beneficial use is the highest use of this land or this water. And the water must be used for beneficial use, which means agricultural, industrial, or municipal household use. If you don't use it for one of those purposes, you can lose your water rights. And then the whole priority concept, users that have lesser rights can use any remaining water, but it cannot negatively affect anyone with more senior water rights. So the senior water rights people or organizations are the ones that are the 600-pound gorilla in the room, right? So the reason I wanted to go over these two is this determined how water would be used and managed and divided in the West. Now we do have some riparian rights in the West, some private land, things like that. But roughly these are the two types of water rights that we have. Okay, so we have a very unpredictable river. This starts, people started looking at the Colorado River and realizing that it is an incredibly unpredictable river. This is the annual Colorado River flow at Lee's Ferry in MAF, means millions of acre feet. So over here on this axis, you can see millions of acre feet. Look at this line just going up and down. It's crazy, right? This is not a river that you can predict. Sometimes it floods and, you know, busts out irrigation canals and completely inundates things. Sometimes it dries to a trickle. So how do you settle the West? How do you settle an area if the main water source that you need is completely unpredictable? So this is a really important thing that people started realizing early on in the settlement of the West. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that prior appropriation would apply in the West, okay, regardless of whether a stream crossed state lines. That's really important because the Colorado River, the Green River, so many of these tributaries cross many state lines. And if you're the first one to use it and you're the farthest downstream or somewhere in the middle, you don't have to worry at all about who's upstream or downstream from you under prior appropriation. So this started huge competition. So now we have to divide up the water because you can't just have it be a free-for-all. If it's a free-for-all, there's going to be a lot of problems. But the whole concept of prior appropriation, the reason riparian rights wouldn't work in the West is that too much land doesn't have any access to riverfront property or waterfront property. So you have to be able to get that water to the land. So once the Supreme Court ruled that prior appropriation was going to be the way we deal with water in the West, competition started and they needed to divide the water up. So what were the 4 objectives of dividing the water up in the West? You guys can tell me if you think that these objectives were met. One was to make sure that development in the West or in the Southwest proceeded in an orderly fashion. Another was to try and eliminate the competition that prior appropriation would cause between the states in the basin. One was to make sure that these consumptive uses or these beneficial uses were prioritized over, say, hydroelectric power or other uses that were deemed less beneficial. And the final one was to minimize the amount of litigation in the process. And I probably shouldn't laugh because I'm giving away whether that actually was an objective that was met. But anyway, these were the 4 objectives that the reason they said, okay, we need to divide this water up so that we can orderly, have an orderly settlement, and we won't have too many water wars. So the Colorado River Compact in 1922, this is, as one water rights lawyer explained to me, basically the word of God in the West. It's also known as nervous upstream users looking downstream at California. Essentially, what happened is Colorado and some of the upstream states like Wyoming, they started, they weren't being settled nearly as fast as California, right? So they start looking downstream, they're going, uh-oh, California is using more and more and more and more water. And with first in time, first in right, that means that they're going to have the right to all this water because they're using it for beneficial use. It was all for agriculture. So there was really a push between the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin to create this compact that bound all the states to a certain amount of water. And this guy on the right here in 1922, it was signed in Santa Fe. This is Herbert Hoover, the Commerce Secretary at the time, who was the one who signed it. So the first way that they did this, you'll recognize this, you'll see this again. The first step was to figure out how much water are we dividing up. So remember, this is 1922. And between 1906 and 1921, the mean flow, the average flow basically, of the Colorado River was 18 million acre feet. Okay, which is represented by this bar right here. So they said, okay, this is great. We've got 18 million acre feet to work with. To be safe, let's just settle on, whoops, sorry about that. We'll settle on 17 million acre feet as an average of the river's flow. And that'll give us a little bit of leeway, for tough years. So they said, okay, we got 17 million acre feet. Now, the first thing they had to do was figure out the best way to divide this water. And they divided the Colorado River Basin into 2 sub-basins. So you have the upper basin, which is Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and a tiny bit of Arizona, right? This little bit of Arizona up here in the corner. And then the lower basin, which is Arizona, California, and Nevada over here. And so what they did was they said, well, half, 7.5 million acre feet or 2,400 billion gallons will go to the upper basin. Plus they'll get 1 million acre feet if it's needed. And then 7.5 million acre feet will go to the lower basin. And then Mexico gets any excess that we're not using. Okay, and I say it first there because after a little while, Mexico said, excuse us, we need a little more water than your excess. And they did sign a treaty to give Mexico a specific amount. So Mexico would get the excess. If they needed more, if there wasn't a lot of excess, then half and half. The upper basin would provide half and the lower basin would provide half of what Mexico needed. So they figured this is great. We've got it worked out, right? We're only using 15 million acre feet. And if there's any excess, it goes to Mexico. So this is where we were in 1922 and into the 30s. They did the dividing line between the 2 basins. This is an aerial view of Lee's Ferry, which isn't too far from where you guys are. And this red arrow here is the water gauging station, which I can't remember who it was, but a historian called it the most important geopolitical place in the entire Southwest, is this water gauging station, because it tells you how much water is going from the upper basin into the lower basin. Now, the actual dividing line between the 2 basins is right here. It's a place called Lee Ferry, singular, and it is about a mile below where the Paria River comes in right here. And the Paria River, so that flow has to be calculated as in terms of what's going downstream into the lower basin. So this line and this line right here, what's being measured here and what's going past here, that is incredibly important. And it's what has allowed for a lot of, for the settlement of the West, really. And then I always have to poke fun at Arizona. All the other 6 states ratified the compact in 1923. Arizona didn't ratify it until 1944. They really didn't want to. They were mad at California and they wanted some concessions. They got a few, but anyway. Okay, so the way that the Colorado River is apportioned, and this is not how it's apportioned, but this is what the percentages end up being. And you can see in the wheel there, you know, California gets the most, Colorado, then Arizona, et cetera, and Mexico gets 9% of the water. If you look at it in terms of acre feet or millions of acre feet, California gets 4.4, Arizona 2.8, Nevada 300,000. And then in the upper basin, you can see the amounts here. And Arizona, again, that tiny little portion of Arizona that's in the upper basin, it gets 50,000 acre feet. And then after the Treaty of 1944-1945 was signed, the international treaty with Mexico, they get 1.5 million acre feet. So they get a solid amount there instead of just the excess. So, oops, I always keep doing that. Okay, in 1948, and this is sort of another parenthetical statement, but I thought it was kind of interesting. In 1948, the upper basin states went, we're getting lower than normal flows, which was, as I point out here, AKA completely normal flows. To divide their water, they decided to divide their water by percentage instead of set amounts. And so, which is, you know, a lot of us think really wise. So they divided by percentages with the exception of this little tiny amount that goes to Arizona right here. That stays at 50,000 acre feet. But what this does is it allows, if there is a shortage, then we just know that Colorado gets 51 3/4, Utah gets 23, et cetera, instead of a set amount, the way it's done in the lower basin. Oops, sorry, figure that out. Okay, did anyone here know where the wild things are? So now that the water is divided up, let's go for it, right? And that's what happened. Once the water was divided up and every state had their amount, and they looked at this river that was very unpredictable and they said, we need to start building reservoirs and pipelines. And we ended up starting what became the massive plumbing system that is the Colorado River. And you can see here all the reservoirs are the barrels, the pipelines are the tubes, and then the spigots letting water out into various parts of the basin. This is, by the way, exactly what Powell warned against. Massive government projects, moving water from one basin into another, things like that. So here is I was having fun with colors when I put this together. So 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project, basically that's where we got Hoover Dam, right? And the associated projects that went along with Hoover Dam. 1934 to 1940, we get the Imperial Diversion Dam and the All-American Canal, which go into California. 1934 to 41, we have Parker Dam and the Colorado River Aqueduct, which also goes into California. 1941 is when that water is first delivered. 1956, the Colorado River Storage Project Act authorizes constructions of all these dams and aqueducts like Glen Canyon Dam, Flaming Gorge Dam, Blue Mesa, Crystal, Morrow Dam, all the dams that are in the upper basin up there. 1967, there are 30 reservoirs in the basin by 1967. We have more now. And they hold a combined capacity of 72.5 million acre feet, which is roughly 10 times the a yearly average. So we've got, in 1967, we have about 10 years worth of water stored. And then 1968, the Colorado River Basin Project, which gives you all of these, the Central Arizona Project, the Dixie Project, Animas La Plata. So this is just a few, and they go along, there's a lot of projects under all of these, but I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of the frenzy of dam building that started after the Colorado River Compact was signed. Now, this is what we have now. And this is an amazing and very depressing to me map. Every single one of these little yellow dots with the red around it is a dam or a water project in the Colorado River Basin. Now, remember, This is the 47th largest river in terms of discharge in the United States. It doesn't even register in the top 142 rivers in the world. This is a tiny river. And look at all of these dams and projects. And then we've got these lines over here are aqueducts. There's the Central Arizona Project. There's the Colorado River Aqueduct. There's the Imperial Canal, the All-American Canal. All the stuff that goes from this side over into the Salt Lake City area, and all of the things that go from the Front Range or from the western slope of Colorado over into the Front Range. So by modern times, we have a massive number of projects along the Colorado River and all of its tributaries. Whoops. So we're going back to this slide now. So now remember that, again, more than 10% of the people in the United States rely on the Colorado River for part or all of their water, and more than 40 million people in total between the United States and Mexico use and rely on the Colorado River. The vast majority of the water in the Colorado River is still from the Colorado River is still agricultural use, although there's more industrial and municipal now growing use than there has been in the past. But go back to this slide, because now we're going to go back to this whole slide. So before I showed you that the average between 1906 and 1921 was 18 million acre feet. Well, these guys didn't have enough information when they figured out how much water was in the Colorado River to divide it up with the Colorado River Compact. This was actually an exceptionally wet couple of decades, or decade and a half. If you look at the average overall from 1906 all the way to 2004, the average is only 15 million acre feet. And if you look from 1987 to 2004, the mean is 13 million acre feet. It's dropping. So what they didn't know was that they actually apportioned and divided up more water than actually exists in the system. So that's a good reason to have reservoirs. It's a really good reason to have water storage, but it also is starting to create some problems as we start seeing population rise and climate change. So our climate is getting hotter. You've probably seen something like this. This is a map of Earth's average global temperature between 2013 and 2017 compared with your baseline between 1951 and 1980. And all of these deep reds and deep oranges are hotter than normal, hotter than the baseline. Look at our region right here. It's not as bad as the Arctic. That's really bad. But the American West, the American Southwest is definitely heating up. And with heat comes less water. If you look at, this is from 2018, the statewide average of snow in Colorado, where the headwaters of the Colorado River are, was 55%. Now, we've had a couple of good years since then and then some bad years, but what we're seeing is that the amount of water in the system is dropping. And that's the trend. Nobody, we get a little, we get kind of complacent when we have one good winter. But it doesn't mean that things are going back to normal. What it means is that we had one good winter. You saw that spiky line along the Colorado River. And you look at this big spiky line. Sure, you have some years with lots more and some years with lots less. But if you look at the average, it is going down over time. So when we look at the average of water supply, here's our water supply, and here's that acre feet again, right? So here's our water supply over time. Here's the dates at the bottom. And you can see that water supply is dropping slowly. Here, somewhere around 2003 was the first time that demand for the Colorado River Basin water actually, well, not the first time, but it was the time that it crossed and continued upward. So the red is projected demand, the blue is projected water supply, and you can see that they are starting to diverge as our population increases and our climate warms and we have less water. There are more and more people needing that water. And that's creating some changes to some of the treaties, not some of the treaties, but some of the ways that the water is managed. So we'll get to those. So just these are some pictures you've already seen. 1999, you look on the left, and in Lake Powell, you can see that the river goes, or the lake goes all the way up into Narrow Canyon. Here's Mill Crag Bend and on up towards Cataract. And in 2017, that is river, not lake. The lake ends right about here. Again, you look at Lake Mead, same thing. And this is really important. Lake Mead is critical. 2000 Lake Mead, here's Grand Wash Bay. It goes way up. It goes way up the canyon, towards the canyon. And then in 2015, look how much smaller Grand Wash Bay is and how much narrower and smaller all of this is. So our water levels are dropping. Now, Lake Mead is really, really, really important because there's part of what's built into water management in the lower basin is that if the level of Lake Mead drops to below this elevation, 1,075 feet above sea level, on any given January 1st, all these emergency protocols kick in, and people have to start giving up water. One of the most important things that has to be given up is, for us in Arizona, the Central Arizona Project. That is a really junior water user. And we agreed when we got the rights to build the Central Arizona Project that it would be the first thing to go if we have to start really kicking in on these emergency protocols. So people have been looking at this. It did drop to 1075 briefly, but it was in June or July. And now it's hovering right above that, but they are predicting as the basin dries even more that that level is going to go down. So we're all in Arizona and other places a little bit concerned about all this. So in 2003, we started dealing with things that had more to do with conservation, preservation of water, management of water for these emergency protocols. California signed something called the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which restricts California's use of water to its allotted 4.4. Now, California's been using more over the years because nobody else was asking for it, and they could. Arizona finally said, excuse us, we'd like some of our allotted water now that we've grown enough. So they have to do voluntary conservation measures. They have to transfer water to municipal districts, things like that. A lot of the QSA is held up in court right now. In 2007, the interim guidelines for lower basin shortages and the coordinated operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead are passed to establish guidelines for water use and delivery and things like that in times of shortage. And then finally, in 2019, at the 11th hour, Arizona finally signed the Lower Colorado River Basin Drought Contingency Plan. We held off. That thing's been in the works for years, and we held off and held off and held off. We finally signed it, literally at the 11th hour. Had we not signed it, the federal government would have taken over managing the water. That was part of the deal. If you guys can't work it out yourself, the federal government's going to deal with it. So every state has a drought contingency plan, and then each sub-basin, the upper and lower basin, have one. And I like this quote. I just put this in there. These plans are a region-wide balancing act among dozens of large water users that will be used in times of shortage. And I highlighted the important thing here. These are a short-term fix. There's dwindling water storage, and it's just an effort, it's a Band-Aid to stave off these shortages. that would trigger these massive cutbacks across parts of the Southwest. So some of these drought contingency plans include incentives for water conservation. The upper basin states now have the right to use Lake Powell as a bank account for their extra water. Arizona is trying to encourage farmers and the tribes to keep water in Lake Mead to avoid that 1075 elevation level issue. Arizona's total use of the Colorado River would decrease by more than 500,000 acre feet. That's 18% of our use during the first year of a major shortage. So we really want to avoid that. They're looking at compensation for farmers who contribute water to the system instead of make a net contribution as opposed to a net deduction of water from the system. So these are just some, they're very complex, obviously. I don't understand or know everything that's in all of these, but these are some of the ideas for these drought contingency plans. I once had somebody ask me, will they ever renegotiate the Colorado River Compact? And I actually asked this same water lawyer, and he said, that's like renegotiating the Bible. That's not going to happen. But what they do is they create these amendments or addendums. For instance, oops, you're not going to let me do that, are you? Well, there we go. Like the interim guidelines for lower basin shortages and the coordinated operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So that is an addendum or an amendment. These are new guidelines to add to the Colorado River Compact. So to end, I guess, this is our Colorado River Basin, right? This outline here is our basin, and you can see the state lines, you can see the cities, and all of this is filled with all of these arguing, angry people because they're terrified, because water is what allows us to live in this environment. So New Mexico and Colorado are fighting with, Arizona, and Wyoming's worried, and Utah's worried. Utah wants to use its last of its allotment to, create the pipeline from Lake Powell to St. George, and everyone looks to California and says, stop being so greedy. Mexico's down here going, hello, we need water. And I think one of the things that people are really starting to recognize is that in order to try and work some of this out, instead of seeing the basin as this, we need to see the basin as this. Recognize that this is an entire basin, and that, yes, there are all these competing legal interests in here, but we have to start seeing this basin as a whole watershed. And a lot of water managers are starting to look at this. I don't know if we'll ever have complete cooperation between everyone in this basin, but looking at it this way instead of this way, I think is a much more much healthier way to do it, and quite possibly might be the only way that we will ever be able to agree on this stuff. There are individual watersheds, for instance, up here in, I can't really find it very well, but up here along the, up in the Aspen area in Colorado, the Roaring Fork Conservancy is a watershed it's a water conservancy within the Roaring Fork watershed, which is a tributary to the Colorado. And these watersheds are doing a lot of the things that Powell recommended. So there are a lot of interesting ideas that are happening, and hopefully we will manage to figure this out before it gets too dire. And I just wanted to end with this picture because I think that this is the water looks like gold, and they say in the West that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. Water is gold in the West, and so I love this picture because it reminds me of how precious water is, more precious than gold, actually. So anyway, that was a lot of. I know that was a lot of you know, like I said, some text heavy slides, which I usually never do, but I thought since this will be recorded and people can come back to it and read those slides if they want, I wanted to add those because some of those had some important information about, you know, how our water is managed and stuff like that. So hopefully that wasn't too yammery, but if anybody has questions, I would be happy to try and answer them with the caveat that I am not a water lawyer. So if you're going to ask me too many legal questions, I will not be able to answer them.
Yeah, and so I'll just jump in there too. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or feel free to drop them in the chat. I will say, I did have somebody private chat me and they said that they didn't have any questions because they felt like you had covered so many of the topics so thoroughly. So I think like as an educator and as a speaker, that's almost one of the best compliments that you can get.
Yeah, thanks. I guarantee you that I did not cover it very quickly, but given the you know, given the venue, it didn't. It gets a little too legally after a while, but
no, it was fantastic, and you were speaking on a subject that affects so many of our lives when we live here in the West, and sometimes we don't even realize the ways that we're affected by it. So I thought you did a great job covering those points.
Thank you.
Yeah, and mainly just in the chat, we're just getting a lot of compliments to you about what a fantastic program it was. So we are coming up just about another minute or so, and that'll round out our hour.
I have a question for Christa.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I know you'd mentioned that the majority of the water is used for agriculture. And I guess I'm new to the area, so forgive my ignorance. But it does seem a little bit like maybe the type of agriculture that's grown in California, I'll say, you know, fruits and vegetables and things that, you know, all Americans eat are you know, grown there in density. I'm kind of trying to contrast that, I guess, with things I see grown around here, which seem more like hay or alfalfa or, you know, foods for cattle or horses. And I guess I'm not enough of an agriculturist to get a feel, but is there a higher use within agriculture? Are we trying to feed people, or could hay and alfalfa be grown in other climates where less irrigation would be required? Is that really a good use in the middle of the desert to try to grow those crops there?
That's a great question, Gail. And I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think there's a higher use within agriculture in terms of the concept of prior appropriation and all that, you know, legally, all the legal stuff. I will say that it's something like 75% of the water used in the Colorado River Basin goes to agriculture. And by that, that means everything from, you know, growing apples to cotton to forage or, you know, hay for cattle and sheep and stuff like that. Of that 75 to 80%, and that number might be dropping a little, the vast majority of that goes to supporting the meat industry. And I'm not saying that as a rabid, you know, vegetarian, vegan, or anything like that, but the vast majority of agricultural water goes to supporting forage for, and a lot of that is sent to China. It's actually not used in this country. If you go to the Imperial Valley, a lot of what's grown there is actually being sent to China and other Asian countries. So, you know, I can't make a blanket statement saying that it's, you know, a horrible use of water to grow hay everywhere in the Southwest. But I think there are definitely places that it's better than others. And if you look at the Imperial Valley, you know, that place is a desert, and it would not support, it supports a multi-billion-dollar food industry, you know, agricultural industry, which it would not support without water from the Colorado River. So I will say also that as agricultural water is beginning to be, you know, we get these massive cities growing, right? The LA metropolitan area, the San Diego metropolitan area, Phoenix, and everyone says, oh my gosh, so many people. Well, those people actually use less water than agricultural. agriculture. So when water gets shifted to municipal areas, it's actually a water saving method, one way to save water.
Excellent. And we do have one question there in the chat. I don't know if you see that. And I think I'm getting this right. It says, I want to know where California would get their water if they ever had the water basin as the one shown on the map someday. And so I'm a little unclear about which map we're talking about here. So I don't know who asked that question, if you want to chime in and just clarify that a little bit.
I think I know what they mean.
Oh, okay, good. Then go for it.
Oh, the wish map? You mean the like John Wesley Powell's map? Probably. Or the way that I was saying, well, what I could say is that California has a reasonable amount of water. Southern California has less than Northern California, but they don't have enough water to support the population and the agricultural industry that they have right now. So if they didn't have Hoover Dam and Imperial Dam and all the dams that impound water to then be taken by these massive pipelines and aqueducts to the Imperial Valley and other places, they would not be able to do what they're doing. They would not get, I mean, maybe they could work on desalination, something like that, but they just wouldn't have, the Colorado River has made that empire possible. Where you know, all those people would have to leave or they would have to grow their crops somewhere else. So it's not, obviously, we're not going to be stopping deliveries of Colorado River water to California, never mind the legal aspects of it. But yeah, they rely on, Southern California relies on Colorado River water. So.
Excellent. All right, so we are now just a little bit past the hour, so I'll just do one more. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to speak up, speak now, or forever hold your peace. But other than that, again, Christa, just thank you so much for presenting this program. You did it with grace and a good sense of humor that just made it thoroughly enjoyable. And for everybody who lives here locally in Kanab, of course, our exhibit is running at the museum up until December 12th. So we'd love to have you stop by and explore that a little bit. So I think that's about it. Okay.
Emily, I just want to say one last thing. Emily, you are welcome to give my email to people if they have further questions. I may not be able to answer them, but I can sort of, I could direct you to some sources, some places you could go to learn more about, you know, the legal aspects of things, and also sort of the future of stuff. Where are things going now in the future? So please feel free to hand out my email if you need to.